Hello friends, welcome to episode 93 of Storyteller Conclave. This is a show all about helping you run the best tabletop role-playing game that you can, whether you're a new storyteller or dungeon master learning the craft, or an experienced storyteller looking to take your game to the next level. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Rob.
How we doing, Rob?
I'm drinking wine.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is nice.
We had a nice dinner.
Yeah.
Some nice wine to go with it.
Yeah, as I was saying, it is a unique experience grilling in the winter, but at the same time, it's kind of nice.
Oh, yeah. For those of you who are not in a climate quite like Michigan here in the United States of America, we have, what'd you say, probably about 5 inches of snow.
If that.
18 degrees Fahrenheit, which is probably about, -5 or so Celsius.
Yeah. Luckily, we don't have a heavy wind, and it's not too humid, so it's just really cold outside.
Uh-huh.
But what's nice is I have a nice little deck that's covered ever so slightly by my house, so I can have my grill set up and just literally walk out, do a little grilling, step right back inside. I have no bugs to deal with, no rain to deal with. It's not too hot. It's just really nice. It's really nice.
Well, certainly something you have to worry about in Michigan. Michigan February is being too hot.
Indeed. So
we had your game last weekend.
Yes, and I will flat out say I did terrible things as a storyteller.
Oh yeah? Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, what's your regrets list?
First one, I fell upon some old things that I used to do, which is way too much description and narration and not enough actual gameplay realistically. I wanted to get through a lot. I wanted to have the orcs that since it was the first time you guys were really getting into the orc world, I wanted to make sure you had a rich experience there and understood what was going on so that it wouldn't have depth. And unfortunately, I just took it too far.
Yeah. I think that was my kind of my feedback for you. It was a lot of lore. No, on the good part though.
Right.
There was a lot of lore.
Yeah, there is. There is.
I saw where you were going with it.
Yeah.
No, the problem was I wasn't absorbing it all, but
right.
But I saw exactly. I would almost rather you have too much content than not enough. You know.
Right. And I think you had made some really great points because I always ask my players what was good, what was bad, what could I have done better.
Yep.
And you always do a nice job of being very honest and giving me a reply. And I will be taking that to heart and working on more visuals to handle those situations so that when you step into a scene, it's more visually appealing, especially from a digital standpoint because I can do that.
And
I'm still getting my feet under me about virtual tabletop because the Foundry is great, but I just don't use it a lot. It's hard to get your feet under something that you've technically presented a total of 6 times maybe up to this point, and so therefore I'm only have 6 experiences to learn from.
Yeah.
But that's the whole point of doing this is getting better and catching the thing. So you may be super experienced, you may be just starting out. There are always things you can learn, which is kind of where we're at today.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
25 years worth of storytelling experiences under both of our belts, and we're both still every game session is a learning experience for us.
And you still make mistakes.
You always find yourself doing so. I don't know that I've ever had the perfect game session that I've walked away from going I wouldn't have done anything different. You know?
Agreed. I would say that for me, any of the game sessions that I've thought or that people have told me have been great game sessions, I look back on them I don't think so. And it's just because of perspective and how it turned out.
Yeah.
So,
well, the thing is that your players, and this is just a great tip in general, is that your players can't see behind the DM screen. You know, it's there for a reason. So, I don't know how many times I've seen. It's said on forum threads and Reddit and stuff like that, where it's my players walked away from my game saying it was the best game session they've ever had in 10 years of playing D&D, and literally the only thing that I had written down was Shady Creek Run, goblins.
Yeah. Yep.
Yep.
Because some things just work.
Yeah.
And there are times when you plan and it works out and you go through all the motions and you feel good about it and the game is good. And there are times when you've made no plans and it comes out just as good. And the magic is in between. It really is. It's about execution.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
speaking of executing
Yes.
In games that are near and dear to your heart.
Yeah.
I will put off my my comments about me having to do a bunch of procrastinate prep, and we will get right into Robotech.
So
now, this is a bit of a baby for you, right?
It is. As much as I wanted to have the Robotech intro, because there's something about the iconic sound of it. Harmony Gold. I will say this. I'm going to be as positive as I can. There's a lot of things that can be said about Robotech as a franchise, as about things that have happened over the last, I will honestly say, 30 years. And the people involved. But I will say that Robotech has some beauty to it and some hilarity to it that you won't find in other content. So it was my first story. It was my first game system. I'll get to that because I've said it a few times before, but I kind of want to give a little history here. So Robotech was actually a culmination, as an American anime, it was a culmination of 3 animes from Japan that were Super Dimensional Fortress Macross, Super Dimensional Cavalry Southern Cross, and Genesis Climber Mospita. And that culminated into a bunch of toys that were basically snap and glue kits that made this stuff, and that stuff got brought over to the United States around 1984. And Harmony Gold saw an opportunity, took that option with and I'll butcher the name. It's Tatsunoko?
Tatsunoko.
Thank you. Productions, and in '85 we had Robotech the anime released in America with English. And it was an American product. It wasn't Japanime. And it was 85 episodes. And it kind of roughly pieced together this this series, I'll say. It's more than a series because there's more pieces than just one series. There eventually became a small 2-run comic that DC did.
Oh yeah.
That just died.
Instantly.
They pretty much killed it instantaneously. But later, shortly thereafter, Palladium Games picked it up as an option and ran with it from 86 through 95, and then reprinted in 1998 the Robotech main series, which was Robotech and Robotech 2: The Sentinels. And that followed its original system. I think the only thing that really differs from that a little bit is they then did a Kickstarter for Robotech Tactics, which didn't go great. I'm not going to get into details on that. And they ended up, the license they lost shortly thereafter. So nothing else was to be created. It got picked up then by Strange Machine Games, who did the Macross Saga, which I really haven't looked at much. And that was in December 2019, because it's been a ways after that. It's an Advantage Roll 6 system, so it's different, but it's relatively light. So we can eventually, we'll both look into it. We might even do a little spotlight on that system as a whole, because it is different.
Yeah, I was gonna say I'd never heard of Strange Machine Games. Until we did research for the show, and I'd never heard of the Advantage 6 system either. So it's definitely something I'm going to give a better look to. But it kind of came up a little late in our research. So
So Robotech as a whole is a anime and a story and setting about effectively the world, if you will, finds a crashed spaceship in the South Pacific Islands that has something called robotechnology. That's what they're calling it. That allows them to transform these mechs from basically fighters into giant robots. So you fly off of an air carrier deck, and then in the air it can transform into other things.
It's like Transformers meets BattleTech.
Exactly. And there are, I can't not say that there are some fights that happen between the creators and BattleTech, and there were some
there absolutely were
lawsuits involved.
Well, no, I mean we can address that
a little bit.
That in the elephant in the room. I mean, when BattleTech first came out, it blatantly ripped off Robotech. Like,
not just Robotech,
not just Robotech,
mostly Robotech.
Yeah, mostly Robotech. So Harmony Gold put their foot down on that one pretty darn quick.
Yeah, very hard. And that was the first really hard fight they had. There were others that went along with it. But I mean, I cannot blame a company for protecting their assets.
Yeah, exactly.
And their copyright. You have to do that. You have to protect those things.
But then they hung on to it for a long time.
Yeah, it lasted a very long time.
Would not allow any sort of negotiations on the topic. And,
which was sad. Which was very sad.
So yeah, there's some salt on both sides of that one. But I kind of understand Harmony Gold's stand.
I do. I mean, business is what it needs to be to handle these things, but at the same time, it's challenging. And I will flat out say, if you go to, I think it's Robotech.com, there is still a thriving site there. Mm-hmm. There are still people who are supporting it. There are still things going forward. There are still discussions and threads. And there's a lot of interesting, you can follow a lot of the history there. But today we're going to focus primarily on the Palladium game system, and what spun off from the fantasy roleplay. So Palladium's take on Robotech basically was a modified version of their fantasy role-playing game. Mm-hmm. That was, I want to say, introduced probably 5 to 6 years earlier. Maybe a little longer than that.
Sounds right, yeah.
I'm trying to remember the dates, but effectively, and it's a 3d6 game, so your statistics are all rolled 3d6. It is then a d20 combat-style game with percentiles. Mm-hmm. So skills are percentile rolls, general tables are percentile rolls, but pretty much all combat is d20. I mean, for the most part.
Yeah, it's pretty familiar to those who.
And then, of course, damage is varied. It is much like the other 80s games where, you know, every weapon used a different die with a different plus, and it was very specific. So in that sense, there was a lot of details that were thrown into it, and this was common of the Palladium games.
It took a lot of cues from AD&D Second Edition, which was big at the time as well.
Very much so.
So you'll see a lot of crossover if you're familiar with AD&D Second Edition at that point as well. Palladium will feel familiar to you, but also I think you said that it was kind of a stylized version of their fantasy system, but I also kind of look at Robotech as almost like a proto Rifts, because it was the first system that uses MDC, mega damage capacity, for things like ship to ship weapons, that were not meant for interpersonal warfare.
Exactly. And we'll get into that a bit more and like where that sits in things. But for the most part, it was designed as an adjunct or as a step up from their fantasy system, but really it took Palladium a pretty large leap. Mm-hmm. It allowed them to expand on their existing TMNT system. Yes, Turtles came up again. Mm-hmm. And expand into Rifts, which became very successful. And Rifts had some beautiful pieces that came after that. So it helped expand that. Now, originally there were, I want to say 8 books, 3 adventures, and 2 additional supplements that were produced for it by Palladium. I actually had all of it.
I want to say I've got like 4 of them.
Okay.
And here's I never played Robotech. I never really got into Robotech. So like this is 100% your baby. But no, like I have those books sitting on my home. In fact, I think right now if you go to our Twitter at @ST_conclave, the banner image of our Twitter page is a shot of my own gaming shelf. Mm-hmm. And I think you can see several titles of Macross, Southern Cross, the Robotech main book may be on there, something like that. But yeah, there's a handful of Robotech books if you can see on there right now.
Yeah, and one of the beautiful things that I will say is that it gave you rich visuals right from the anime, and then expanded upon that in technical details. So in that sense, it really truly was a blending of like second edition D&D with good visuals, but also BattleTech. Like I had what a mech looked like, not only the exterior, but some of the interior.
Oh yeah.
And that was something that endeared it to me immediately, was because now I was seeing this anime come to even more light, more reality. But things start to shift from there a little bit when you start getting into the mechanics. So attributes were IQ, mental endurance, mental affinity, physical strength, physical prowess, physical endurance, physical beauty, and speed. Mm-hmm. And it's odd.
That is the standard Palladium set.
Yeah, and it's you listen to these things and you're like, that's a lot of stats. And it is. It really is a lot of stats. But at the same time, when you think about some of the other systems that were coming out at that time, things were stat heavy. Like charting for stats was an important thing. Figuring out how to lay out a character so that you could accommodate whatever was going on. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that a lot of people ignored beyond IQ and wits, which were basically the two, your IQ and your mental affinity, was mental endurance. Mm-hmm. And it was one thing that kind of sits in the background of all of the Palladium games, is this concept that you are under a certain amount of stress.
Yep.
And this game pushes that just a little bit, but it's under the covers. It's not nearly as obvious as most people would go to see it. And I'll address that. I'll keep going into that. And actually, it was expanded upon in the new system that was put out. They actually leaned into that a little bit.
Cool.
Beyond that, you had, much like at the time, you had classes, just like D&D had classes at the time. You know, you were a ranger or whatever. And these are a set of skills that are predetermined, but some that you can select. And then a series of weapon proficiencies. Because the idea was that when you were starting your character in this, you weren't zero. You weren't starting at ground level 0. You were a hero at 0. So you were already a pilot, or you were a fighter pilot, or you were a engineer, or you were a gunnery control person. So you were already part of this military complex, or a civilian who was getting involved that was already doing something. So you have skills. You've been working around. You just haven't stepped. This is your moment of heroism that's coming up.
Yeah, that's pretty typical for Palladium games in general. I mean, having played a lot of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, After the Bomb, and stuff like that. That's Ninjas and Super Spies, Heroes Unlimited. That's, you know, it's basically like, yeah, you start out as 0, but you start out as a 0 hero.
Correct.
And
correct.
Already head and shoulders above your peers.
And in all honesty, this mimicked 100% what was already out there for class design. So if you went to D&D back in the day, you had skills that were predetermined for you, what you could have. You might get to pick a few things. You had weapons proficiencies. That was common. You had authorized equipment, and you had wages that you got. And again, this fit the board for every other game. It was just the way they detailed it made it seem so bulky to a lot of people.
Yeah.
And then the rules kind of wrapped around that, and I'll get into those mechanics in a minute about how firearms was different than physical hand-to-hand combat and how they broke that down, but I think that had a lot more to do with the past and what they had designed for fantasy. But then they took it a step further because, again, they were leaning into a more robust character, something that a lot of the systems at the time didn't do, and that was they had alignments. They went beyond good and neutral and evil and the gray areas in there. They went and called them something better or something more and gave you an idea of how to play that character.
See, and this is one of the things that, like, man, as much as, like, I don't know that I would ever be able to go back to Palladium. Just because I think my style of preferred game has shifted so much from what Palladium is. But man, every time Palladium comes up, this is still the best thing that Palladium has ever brought to the table is their alignment system. Because not only do they give them, they eschew the typical like 9 square graph of good, neutral, and evil, lawful, neutral, and chaotic.
Right.
They give them names to make them feel unique. So you don't feel like a spot on a grid. You feel like you've got a personality.
Exactly.
But then the detailed list they come up with for things that this character of this alignment will find acceptable and things that they will find unacceptable.
And it matches across. It's basically 11 answers to statements. And all of the statements match each other. So you can look between principled, scrupulous, unprincipled, anarchist, miscreant, aberrant, diabolic, and know how...
Will not steal, but might take dirty money or goods. Will not kill a hostage, but may intimidate or threaten one.
Right. Will kill without question.
Will kill without question, or will never kill an innocent, but a worthy opponent may,
Yeah.
But they go through and they define all these different scenarios for you to give you a very good outline of how to play that alignment.
And I think as a early player, that gave me a look into what role-playing really was. Without having, at that time when I started, I definitely did not have an acting career when I was in middle school. You know, I still don't have an acting career, but I've done some acting, and I've understood where that comes from. Not having that theater background and understanding, it gave me something I could look at and understand. Oh, so that's the thought pattern behind that.
Oh, yeah.
How can I get behind a character who is this? And it helped friends of mine who were playing with me, like, okay, look at these and tell me which one of these your character would follow. And a lot of people were following under unscrupulous, or they were, you know, leaning into, anarchists, you know, or at least miscreant. And they're like, wow, I guess I'm dark. And the answer is no, they don't define it as light or dark. Like, a hero can be miscreant and still be a hero.
It was kind of like good, selfish, and
yes,
evil.
Correct.
And I really like that they defined not neutral, but selfish.
Right.
Like, look, I'm going to look out for numero uno, and if your goals align with mine, then hey, cool, we can work together. And the moment they don't, see ya.
Yep.
I may throw you under the bus.
Then they took it a step further. So now we have this rich inner piece, this side of a person that you can understand what their motivations are. When things happen beyond injury, which was basically hit points, was kind of a minor thing, you had insanities and phobias and obsessions, addictions.
Oh, yeah.
These were all included in character design and weren't necessarily optional. Like, they were things you had to define because drama and stress cause issues. And that helps make a character. And so looking at this again, I was like, wow, there's a lot of depth here to making characters. Now, initially, when I was playing in middle school, we didn't include those. At least not in Palladium. We did in Rifts, but it makes full sense that if I'm literally driving around in a 100-ton vehicle, you know, blasting holes in living aliens that are equally my size, I'm going to have a little trauma.
Yeah, a little bit.
You know, watching my friends get violently ejected into space is a problem. You know, and there's mental breakdowns that happen. And so they kind of worked through that. And what was funny was they then went optional rules, age, weight, sex. Those are optional. Like, literally optional. It's not as important as these other pieces.
Yeah.
And that really showed the weight of the system where they were leaning into it. And I thought that was a wonderful start point for anyone. Granted, again, I'll get into some of the issues of that, but for the most part, I saw that as an opening, a doorway into something. The mechanics themselves, again, for the time, fit almost every other system. You had a roll and keep style D20. Sometimes there were bonuses that were added onto that for making it.
Sometimes.
It
was. I would say it was Pathfinder levels of bonuses, where it was like +1 from this, +2 from this, -2 from this, but +3 from that. So it's
I will say that it was not to the levels that Shadowrun brought into it.
No.
You didn't have as many conditional modifiers on the other side that were reducing things. But yeah, your player would add bonuses, and usually it was not so much a more than 1 or 2 bonuses that stacked up. It was just that your bonuses kept getting larger.
Yeah.
And that was the key, was that you'd have an attack bonus when you were doing melee, or you'd have an attack bonus when you were firing, and then because you're doing a burst, it's this, you know, kind of a situation. So really your bonuses were pretty much equal in a lot of ways to Pathfinder and 2nd edition D&D in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
The difference was skill checks were done with a percentile
die, yep.
Under.
Yes.
So effectively, if I have a skill in pilot aircraft, and I want to do a maneuver, which is kind of a unique things on its own, I had to roll under the percentile because every time I skill upped, I would get either 3 or 5% more added to my skill level. Right.
It's it actually runs a lot like GURPS and Steve Jackson games, where your numbers will get higher. For your skills, and your goal, because that number is getting higher, it increases the threshold of space underneath that number, essentially. So at 95%, you've only got a 5% chance to fail, because all you have to do is roll a 95 or under. And that is as I remember in Palladium games, is as high as skills ever go, because they always want to have a margin of failure there.
Indeed.
I had a funny story about rolling a double aught in a Palladium game.
Okay.
That is literally as high as you can roll, so it is always a failure. In fact, it's basically your nat 1 crit failure of Palladium.
Depending on what you're rolling.
I was playing an assassin.
Okay.
And I had snuck into the enemy camp. This was in a fantasy game.
Mm-hmm.
I snuck into the enemy camp, and they had stolen a magical book that we were trying to do something with. Mm-hmm. So I was being the stealthy one. I snuck in, and I grabbed the book out of the general's tent. The general was there sleeping, and I was like, "No, it would be dishonorable if I gacked you right now. We'll see on the field of battle."
Sure,
and I snuck back out. So the storyteller says to me, roll a stealth check to get out of here. I roll my percentile, I roll a double 0, which is a 100 on a percentile die.
Yep.
Critically failing my stealth check. I poke my head out of his tent, I look to the right, I look to the left. As I'm looking to the left, I step out, right smack dab, and literally run into a guard.
Mm-hmm.
The guard says, "Hey." I go, "Hey, sorry, didn't mean to bump into you," and just stepped around him.
Okay.
And
so you failed a stealth check, but...
The guard was like, yeah, sure, be more careful next time.
Okay.
And I walked away from him.
Yeah, you were noticed, but... Yep. But did you make... I would say a consequence for that would have been something else. There would have been more of a consequence to that. I wouldn't put it to the level of... necessarily some video games where it's suddenly the alert goes up, the alarms go off, and 30 people are shooting at you.
I think the consequence was mitigated because of how well I handled it. How I just slipped right into the hole. No, I belong here. It's fine. I just bumped into a guard. No big deal. Just be more careful where you're walking.
Yep.
And then just stepped around him. Mitigated the circumstances from it. So it's all about knowing looking like you're supposed to be there. So
yeah. Another thing they did differently in Robotech beyond just the percentile for skill checks and such was a combat system that was variant from what others were doing, and that was you have initiative, which everybody was used to. You have an attack or roll for strike. Your defender then gets dodge, which may include dodge, parry, or entangle.
Yep.
As a roll. Then damage would be calculated, and the player would get the ability to roll with
the punch. Yep.
And that didn't, a lot of times, that didn't matter whether you were doing, someone was shooting you, or someone punched you, or you were in your mech and you were rolling with the hit. Now, it would mean it would reduce it, or you could fail your roll with the hit as well, and now you've got a problem. You didn't maneuver properly. So it presented another challenge, but definitely added more to the theatrics of playing a hero, and lended that there was more chances to more survival chances, effectively. And I liked that. I liked that you were constantly leaning into the hero doing heroic things.
See, I see where they were going with it, but I got to admit, this has always been one of my sticking points with Palladium games in general, was this combat system. And it reminded me a lot of Shadowrun, in that there was a roll to see if it happened, then the defender got a roll, and then the attacker got another roll that might have been mitigated by the earlier defender roll, but then the defender gets another. It's like, in D&D, you roll a d20, and if it's over their AC, you roll some damage. But we're in Palladium here, you've got potentially four separate rolls, depending on what's going on, to try to resolve if there's even damage rolled and how much of it gets rolled. So it can. The real tricky point with Palladium is that it strikes you have to try to strike a balance between the realism that it offers you and the speed of your gameplay. So you need to decide how many of those rules you're actually going to use. And I mean, it gets a little quicker as your gameplay goes on, but I always found that it just got a little bogged down for me. But I mean, again, it's very realistic.
And I really didn't feel that it, as a whole, that the combat system added any more complexity than D&D had at the time. or even that some of the other systems had at the time. Some had way more complexities in their combat than this. And some still to this day have way more complexities than this. I mean, I can honestly say that when I looked at Shadowrun, I was like, whoa, this is way more complex. And that was just to try and hit. Like, it was way more complex in that sense. So this definitely had a different edge to it, and I liked the heroism aspects of it. I still do in that sense.
Yeah.
We talked a little bit about SDC versus MDC, which is a damage difference, and really all it was saying big things are stronger, inevitably, that you're not going to be able to just do things because they're 100 times more, and therefore they won't react to these lighter things. If I hit a tank with a baseball bat...
Let's define what SDC and MDC are before we go into particulars.
Right.
SDC stands for Structural Damage Capacity. So, like, people and things have SDC.
Doors.
So, like, you know, people have a certain amount of bumps and bruises, you know, that you can take, and the reason they differentiate that from hit points, and this is, you know, an interesting layer of realism for you, is that, like, if you stub your toe on the corner of the door, like, that's not going to kill you. It's not going to do hit point damage.
Right.
You know, it's not tapping into your life. It's an inconvenience, and you're going to swear a lot while you hop around for the next 5 minutes. But that's SDC damage. Objects only have SDC because they are not alive. They do not have hit points, so they have an amount of structural damage they can take before they are broken. Larger vehicles like Veritechs, tanks, the battleships, the SLD-1 or something like that. SDF-1 have MDC, and that is Mega Damage Capacity. Every point of MDC is worth 100 points of SDC, and SDC weapons cannot damage an they cannot deal MDC.
Correct.
So even if you take an SDC weapon and you roll 347 damage, that does not equal 3 MDC.
Correct. So in other words, if I've got a baseball bat and I hit a tank, it is going to damage the paint. It's going to, chip, maybe scuff it a little bit, but it is not going to disable that tank.
You are not impairing the tank.
Right. Likewise, if I pull out a submachine gun and shoot it at a tank, I am denting it. I'm probably going to really make it look terrible, but again, I'm not impairing that tank, no matter how many clips I unload or how accurate my shots are.
Now, on the other hand, if I pull out a 1d4 MDC laser pistol,
I can laze through it.
You can burn a hole right through it. Now, mind you, that tank might have 100 MDC, and your 1d4 laser pistol isn't going to do crap to it, but it will at least burn holes through it, and it will do amazing things to a person, or any other thing that requires that has SDC. A wooden door, a wall, drywall, a normal car, blow right through it. And that, I think, is a really interesting thing about how MDC works. Some people think that MDC is a level of overpower, but it's... I think what it does really effectively is it puts into the world that, those weapons that are, you got hit by an anti-tank cannon. No, you didn't soak it just because you have a lot of hit points, I think that's what it does really well, so.
Yeah. And I think the stepping away from that, the other thing that they have a lot in their mechanics, and this is something that Palladium's really known for, are charts. Whether it be hit locations or crit tables or, the ridiculous detail that they put into their weapons and ammo and effects that things can do. I mean, one of the things that they are known for is their literally arms catalog. Like, there were advanced weapons catalogs that they put out for their games that was literally just a book of guns and armor and ammo and things like that. And I mean, that some of their errata books that followed up from the main book were just that. They were more equipment manuals than anything else.
Now, how much of that stuff actually showed up in the cartoon? Because I never really watched the cartoon. It was a little inaccessible to me at the time.
So that's the thing, is that Robotech as a whole, the game system, was piecemeal follow-up to the anime. So it was just finding pieces of the anime and saying, we can name and define what this is, which makes assumptions that the following things also exist.
Okay.
And I think that's really where where it falls. I mean, effectively, what I like to say is that Palladium's Robotech was the fan service of the anime, so that you knew what the missing pieces were. It kind of became canonic for what was missing out of the anime, which you didn't see behind the scenes.
Somebody doodled something in the background of an anime episode, and they went, "Yeah, that looks interesting. What do you think that's a, portal generation, you know, whatever." Like,
so like something that was in one scene, like a shuttle, suddenly was now completely flushed out, and everything about it was detailed because it was now part of the world, which assumed how, we now knew how many pilots it was, how big it was, what would fit into it. But again, we had to figure out, well, how fast does it go? What weapon systems does it have? Those weren't in that episode. So those things had to be filled in and flushed out. And that's really where kind of Robotech's Palladium filled in those gaps and made it interesting and gave us more things to play with.
Yeah, right on.
And of course, toys. So what does Robotech do well? I think one of the things that it does exceptionally well, it was a good start of complex characters in a game. Characters who are not just a set of skills, but had strong motivations, they had deep issues, and it leaned into that you were a person who was going to experience situations that involve stress and trauma. And that this is bigger than just your character. You were a hero in a situation.
Essentially in a war, too, with an alien race.
Yeah.
A
war for your world.
Yeah.
And for the future. And an invasion at that, which was a whole nother thing. It blended for the first time, really, giant robots and people. Now, it wasn't the first, but it was the first time that you were able to take visuals that were part of an existing world, an anime, and blend it with something that was direct. Much like they did with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, taking things out of the comic and bringing it into the system.
Yeah, that was always something that, like, I said, I never really got into Robotech when it was, when it was in its heyday. But I got to admit, though, like, watching from the sidelines, it always did capture my inspiration in my imagination. And I'll be darned if, little 5-year-old, 6-year-old me didn't look at that Veritech and think, man, that'd be so cool to fly around and have a giant robot stomp around.
It was very cinematic for me, and this was a game that pushed that cinema for me.
Yes.
So, honestly, it also gave an interesting universe connection to the other Palladium products. So now you not only just had one game, but you had a game with multiple worlds. And then Rifts opened that door even further, because it was a common system. Whereas D&D was a system for fantasy roleplay in the D&D world, it really didn't have anything else. But now I had Palladium, which offered me Robotech, TMNT, Rifts, and I was like, oh, I can play any of these games and I understand them.
Yeah.
And that opened a whole grouping of games there. It was a nice system to start with, in that sense. The other thing was there was little left to question on how to do something. If you wanted to do some of the game, the rules were pretty straightforward.
Yeah,
they weren't great, but they definitely solved the question.
You might have to do some skipping around in the book, but I guarantee Palladium has a rule for it.
Correct.
Absolutely.
And that made it also made the outcomes very easy for a storyteller to say, okay, well, I'm going to punch the hull of the ship with my Veritech's fist. Oh, okay. You don't have to roll to hit because it's right in front of you.
Right. It has an MDC value and an armor value.
So your roll for punch,
your punch is going to do a certain amount of MDC damage. So
right. So let's roll that, and then let's roll a crit table because technically you're punching a hull, so you're going to end up doing damage to the fist. And okay, you didn't take any damage on the fist. Great, of your mech, and so now there's a hole. All right, I'm going to tear it open. Okay, there's rules for that.
Rules for that too. Yeah.
Great. So in that sense, it gave not only a role-playing game, but also a certain sense of tactics that BattleTech had as well. So it was very easy to do all the maneuvers and figure out what you were doing. It wasn't simplified. It was detailed.
Now, Robotech though was all theater of the mind's eye though, right? So it didn't have the miniatures grid style rules that BattleTech did.
It didn't have those styles of tactics. It wasn't even really discussing those kinds of tactics. Because it assumed that your mind's eye, you already had the view of the anime and of the models and references that were already coming out. So you already had an idea of what it was going to look like, but it didn't get into the minutia, I'm moving 4 hexes or anything like that, to have those scenes. It just assumed that you were going to have a discussion about getting behind cover or using debris or whatever to have your actions mean something when you were doing something in combat. And, I mean, it really did show off that aspect of the storytelling, was that they didn't lean into the tactics. They were trying to move away from that. And looking back on it now after all these years, I can say that's not something they were trying to focus on. They were trying to focus on, let's get through combat in a theatrical way that looks cool. And then get back to telling a story.
It's difficult to be theatrical and cinematic when you've got a grid constraining you and hard numbers defining where things are and aren't.
Yeah, and a ridiculous amount of initiative turns going through all the players to try and slow things down. It was very much encounter to encounter quick steps, is what they were trying to get to. So yeah, there were some really great aspects to it that I think made it very endearing and kept me engaged, regardless of how challenging and daunting things were, which is kind of where Robotech falls apart. The presentation of the book is beautiful on the cover, and there's some lovely art in it, but it gets very overwhelming and text-heavy quick. The rules are very fast to you. They are very detailed. It felt like classic 2nd edition D&D, where you open the book and it's charts and text and not a lot of this is how we get into gaming.
Yeah, that's last time I cracked open I think it was when we were doing our Palladium system spotlight, and I pulled out Heroes Unlimited, I think it was, and that was one thing that really struck me. It was like, okay, page 2, rules. Page 1 is introduction, page 2 begins the rules, page 347 still rules, and that can be a little disheartening for new players, certainly.
I mean, and there's a lot of charts, and charts tend to draw people away.
Yeah.
Like, it's not something you want to see very often. But at the same time, if you're looking at those, that's a lot of good detail to help you. It's just a lot, and it can be overwhelming. Especially if you've come from very light systems, it can be like GURPS is the most daunting of details, without a doubt, and it feels like there's too much going on. This is definitely within that step. The
Knock says War and Peace, the rule book. It can be at times.
It can
feel that way. Yeah. I mean, the good news about Palladium is that there are some core systems to it.
Yes.
If you understand how skills work, you understand rolling percentile, boom, you've got most of how your skills work.
Yeah.
You understand D20 plus modifiers over a threshold, you understand how most of combat works.
Yeah.
So beyond there, yeah, it's a lot of other like fiddly little stuff and charts for this and that, critical hits and whatnot and stuff like that. So it gets into a lot of minutia from there, but at least the core of the gameplay, I would say, is pretty quick to pick up.
Some of the examples of combat in it are also a little weird, because it was written almost in a discussive format at times, where it's talking to you directly as the player who's reading the book. Like, literally, I'm going to read this. A car screeches to a halt 60 feet away. 2 men with heavy-duty bazookas take cover behind their compact car. Now the tank is in trouble. Why? Because the bazookas do mega damage. You think, why are these lunatics in this example, and why are they trying to beat my tank? Like... And it's because they're trying to engage you through conversation, and sometimes it gets a little odd in the discussion.
Yeah.
But I liked that. I liked that it was communicating with you. You know, that it was like you needed to be. You were part of the discussion. You were part of the learning process. The changes where things get into a little bit are where combat gets a little heavy, where they're talking about differences in combat, volleys, bursts, called shots, changes between physical combat and firearm combat.
Yeah.
It feels very much like second edition D&D or some of those other systems where they were layering ideas in, and not really telling you that you didn't have to play with those.
Right.
Because they weren't listed as optional. They were just another layer of things that you have to remember.
Yep. And then you get to a certain extent where you're like, well, are we doing a role-playing game here and telling a story, or is this a reality simulator? You know?
Or it's just a tactical gameplay done in a different rule set.
How many degrees in physics do I need to enact combat in this game system?
Exactly. Or do I need to know all of the little... Do I need to know all of the percentile chances of things?
Mm-hmm.
So statistical analysis comes in as I'm going to be successful, kind of a thing.
Right.
The other thing that I think the game didn't do well is that it is based on an anime, and there is an assumption that you kind of understand the universe.
Yeah.
And have watched it, because and I didn't really recognize this when I first got it, that the first book only has about 5 pages in it dedicated to discussing Robotech and the world.
Oh yeah.
Only 5 pages.
You're not wrong, because, like I said, I've got 4 of those books sitting on my shelf. I've actually read through a bunch of them.
Yeah.
Mostly because I understood Palladium, so I understood at least the game system references and whatnot.
Yeah.
But darned if after 4 books I could tell you what the darn things were about.
Right.
Now I've got the Southern Cross manual.
Yeah.
What's Southern Cross?
Still
don't know.
It's not a great song. I'll go with that. But I mean, if you didn't watch the anime, you were missing out on quite a bit of the detail. On the other hand, if you did watch the anime, this filled in the gaps.
Right.
And I will say, over the course of the 8 books that they put out, they filled in a lot. They grew that. And threw in a lot more detail about what was going on. In fact, there were some beautiful timelines that they put in eventually that explained the whole universe, explained what was going on, who the protagonists and antagonists really were, went into details about the characters in more detail, eventually leading out to talking about who the true antagonist was, the Robotech Masters, and where they set and why all of this was really going on in the first place. And I think that was really wonderful. I think that really helped solidify things, but it took time to get to that point, and you really had to invest in the entire system to get that.
Yeah.
And that makes it kind of difficult to get into that first book, that initial core book. Especially when literally 20 plus pages of the book is literally about equipment and mechs and weapons. Most of the book is just gear.
It's just technical manual.
It's just technical references. And then the literally last, probably I want to say 5 or 6 pages of the book are example characters that are literally the characters from the anime listed out as they would be characters in the game, and a little bit more detail about the game for fan service, which was the SDF-1, the original ship that crashed, and what they ended up fixing up, all of the technical details about that ship, which is kind of irrelevant in the grand scheme of things, but really neat if you're interested in Robotech.
Yeah.
How would you love it if you had I'll use this just as a simple reference, if you had a role-playing game that was based upon Harry Potter, and literally the last 4 pages of the books listed out all of the major characters, the heroes and the villains, and then the last 2 pages of the book is a complete detail on Hogwarts. Every room, its size, what its purpose was, where it sat, a detailed floor map of the entire building, floor by floor, including, a digital representation, maybe even that you could, and sketches of places that you didn't see in the movies, and that clearly has more hours of footage and stuff than this 86 episode anime, but at the same time, that's effectively what they were doing.
Yeah.
And I can't say that it was wrong, but I can say that it felt off. That it didn't do a lot of service to people who weren't interested. So
Knox is asking, actually, in the live chat, did they do the same for TMNT with reference to filling in a lot of the blanks and stuff like that?
Yes and no.
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, the advantage they had for TMNT is that Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird were working with them quite a bit on that product. So, it wasn't that they were extrapolating from Eastman and Laird's comics and stuff like that, and then coming up with stuff to fill in the blanks. It's that they were having those blanks actively filled in by Eastman and Laird.
Yeah.
And so they were kind of tying together a lot of the world building and whatnot. But yeah, to a certain extent. I mean, they did transdimensional TMNT, Turtles in Time, things like that. Turtles, is it Turtles in Space, I want to say?
Yes.
They did. So, I mean, there were some other things where, like, the Turtles were getting into some of their wackier adventures with, like, the Fugitoid. And like the Utrons, which were if you watch the cartoon, that was Krang. Krang was a Utron.
Yes.
But they were actually good guys. They were like interdimensional refugees in the comic. And they turned them into bad guys for some reason in the cartoon.
Turtles in Time, I think, was the other one, wasn't it?
Yeah, Turtles in Time, where they got into Renee and the Time Lord.
Yep. But I mean,
Lord Simultaneous. That was his name. Yes.
I mean, in realistically, you did just like with Robotech. You had the characters from the anime in the, I should say, comics, listed in the book with stats, so you understood how they fit into the game universe. Yeah. As well as a lot more availability for character creation, other things like, and it was neat. It was definitely chart heavy again and fit the same kind of design, but it opened a lot of doors, and I thought that was beautiful. Yeah. And on the same thing. We did get a couple questions.
Yeah, we got about 10 minutes left. We have 2 questions, I think.
Yep.
So the first one actually comes to us from the Mad Elf. What are some systems other than Palladium that would be a good fit for Robotech?
So, it is a heroic system. So technically you could do it in Apocalypse World. You could do it in a 7th Sea hybrid. And Rifts was actually done in Apocalypse World. So there's a translation already there, technically. But like I was saying, there was another system that picked it up released in 2019, which was the Advantage 6, and that actually uses 6-sided dice only for taking actions, and you are accepting successes, and I think it's 1, 2, 3 are failures. 4 is most of the time a failure. 5 and 6 are successes, and then determining the number of successes based kind of achieves your goal. But they included a lot of the same heroic and drama situations where failures added drama and situations added drama, and you could avoid a failure by doing something heroic and accepting a dramatic consequence. For instance, my character is being shot with missiles, and I roll to do a maneuver to miss it, and I fail. I could ask for a heroic moment in which I'm able to just barely dodge out of all the missiles way, but those missiles go past me and hit something else. And I witness like the death of a bunch of people, and now I have that drama on me.
Gotcha.
Okay. I'm able to get away from the person who was shooting at me, and now there's a revenge. Now they want to get me. And so they'll stop at nothing to have this fight finish properly. Kind of a thing.
Gotcha.
So
almost like picking up the hunted background from some.
Exactly. So it was it's a narrative heavy kind of system, and it definitely fits the feels of Robotech and some of the pieces that go along. And they do a really good job in the rule set for it, literally detailing experiences from the show and how they fit into the system. And I liked that. So I think those kind of things would definitely lend into it, without a doubt.
I mean, arguably, just because of their origins and their past tussles with Harmony Gold, I think if you wanted to do Robotech in the BattleTech system, I mean, you would probably strip it of a lot of its heroic feel and turn it more into a heavily tactical game. But
yeah, they tried that. It was with Kickstarter, and we're not going to go there. I'll be honest. That's really a lot what it was.
Man, I'm so thirsty. There's so much salt in.
There's a lot of salt in that. It could have been very successful, and there was a lot of people who wanted it to be successful.
Yeah.
I wanted it to be successful, and unfortunately, I'm going to leave it at unfortunately. There was a lot of things that happened that did not work out right for them.
We'll leave it at big oof.
Yeah, really big oof.
All right, and our second question comes from Knox in the Box. Snuck it in just under the wire.
Yes.
If you want, the question is here, what would be the best way, if I don't change stations here on Discord that I'm reading it off of, what would be the best way to ease someone who's used to a looser playstyle into something more structured and accountable? I don't know. I kind of think it's a bit of a natural progression. You can start off with the looser playstyle for sure, but then it's all about just adding more layers of structure, I suppose.
I would say there's two ways you can look at this. One, if your players are looking for a looser playstyle, you can definitely play this with a looser playstyle, without a doubt. The structure of the system is layered so that you could peel it off and not have a problem. The problem comes into the one you pointed out, where players are like, well, I expected it to work this way because of the rules, so that I could do this and this. Now I can't.
Right. You're saying he's not getting a grapple response or something like that because you're just not using that rule. But I was counting on him doing that because I've got an ability that says when he does a grapple, I get a bonus to blah, blah, blah,
Right. So, but again, if you're playing in a light rule system, you can still say that still happens, without a doubt. I think if you're wanting your players to play in a more technical or tactical kind of feel game system, always start with something light. Step them into it. Give them something basic to work from in a framework that they're comfortable with already.
Yes.
So for instance, if I was going to be bringing my players from D&D into, or D&D is a bad example, but D&D into something more like this, where I would want them to have a little bit more care about their supplies and things like that, I might start them in a D&D game, before I even think about getting into this, and see how they handle encumbrance and see how they handle equipment, and go from there.
Yeah.
So I would say work from what you know. The other option is don't. Throw them in and see. Just let them know this is how the game is going to be played, and roll with it. And see which of your group does that, because in some cases, if that's what you want to do as a storyteller, there is a group there for you to play with. They're out there. But if you want to play with your group, then you have to make sure that you can accommodate and work with them and let them grow into what you want to play.
I feel like for a system like Robotech or like Palladium in general, you're going to know by character creation whether that system is for you or not.
Yep.
And so, if you get halfway through character creation and you go, this is a lot, is this what the game is like, then maybe it's not the game for you. On the other hand, if you're like, man, this is a lot of detail, this is cool, then you'll probably have a good time with it.
Yep.
I'd be a little loath to sink or swim them, but at the same time, I understand the con of trying to ease them into it is that you may set a false expectation.
Yeah.
You give them a little bit of a lighter system, and then they're like, oh, okay, I can handle this, and then you bump it up, and then it's like, well, this isn't like the other thing that I liked now.
Right. Yeah. So, it really is up to you as a storyteller. If you're gearing to play a game that way, gear into it. If you're not, then be prepared to work with your players and maybe lighten it up a bit.
Yeah.
So our next week's topic is give them a nuke. Giving a players vast power, but only once. And how to handle that.
So you can find us on Twitter at @ST_Conclave, on Instagram at @ST_Conclave. You can listen to us live every Wednesday night at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on mixlr.com/storyteller-conclave. And you can join us on Discord. If you are one of our Patreons, you can join us in our live chat during said broadcast. But you can find that link up on our Twitter as well as our website, storytellerconclave.com.
Speaking of Patreon members, we want to thank Knox, Sam, the Arcane Asylum, Sparkle Motion, and Vedran for getting us at the I am terrible tonight. And helping us every week. We appreciate all of our Patreon members. Our pre-show music is Arcane Anthems. You can find that at patreon.com/Arcane Anthems. Our intro music is Beyond the Warriors by Geekfrog. You can find that at geekfrogmusic.weebly.com. And our outro music, which you're hearing right now, is Only Our Footprints in the Sand by Midair Machine. You can find that at soundcloud.com/midairmachine/tracks.
Big shout out as always to our families, Vicky and Sean. Thank you so much for loving us and supporting us. Our friends who've sat with us at our tables over the years and given us these great experiences to share. And you, every single one of our listeners. We love you so much.
Love you guys.
Stay safe. Good night.